Welcome again to another Synthplex 2022 podcast. My name is Florentino Buenaventura, and I am super honored to be here with a gentleman that really inspired modern music, if you like anything contemporary, hip-hop, EDM, country, it doesn't matter. This man's inventions and some of the technology that he brought about has changed the world and changed the sound as we know it. And I'm just super honored. We have Mr. Dave Rossum here with us. And thank you, Dave, for joining the podcast.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm very happy to be here.
So Dave, I'm gonna selfishly make this about me for a moment. All I know is the first time I experienced the Emulator 2, it was a clinic at, I think it was K Music in Sacramento. Mm-hmm. And a guy came up and showed this thing called sampling. I'm like, what is a sampler? I knew synthesizers. I knew the Oberheims. Tom's here somewhere in Synthplex. He's got a meet and greet here later on this afternoon. I knew of the Prophets. But when I seen the Emulator 2, and then I seen it on Ferris Bueller's Day Off, I was like, I gotta have one of those. But they were a little pricey for a teenager at that particular time. Yeah. So with that said, man, tell us, how did you get started, and how did the development of the sampler, there were a few different folks that were working on samplers, but you really brought it into a real world, not say the average person, but a person that wasn't a major star at the time could afford.
Mm-hmm. Well, we started Emu Systems. Emu, by the way, is short for electronic music, and of course, our mascot is the Australian bird.
Yeah.
But we started that to make traditional analog modular synthesizers. And I had studied, actually, my degree from Caltech is in molecular biology, but my interest at the time was applying computers to molecular biology. So I had a strong background in computers and digital logic design, but synthesizers at the time were pretty much all analog. So throughout the 70s, my design skills, particularly for sounds, were all in terms of analog signal processing gear, but I was very aware of the idea of digital signal processing. And in the late 70s were just the beginnings of this technology that we call DSP, digital signal processing, that we use so much today, with the tremendous, the Moore's law. Everybody knows Moore's law means that digital chips double in power and have in cost every 18 months or so, and that's gone on for so many years. That's the computer revolution we were in. So, like I say, in the late 70s, I was aware of digital electronics and the fact that you could turn a sound into a series of numbers in a computer. But at those days, it wasn't practical to synthesize sounds, to actually generate those numbers by a computer. The computers just weren't fast enough or accurate enough. Anyway, in 1980, there was a shift in direction in our company. All of a sudden, we had circumstances that we needed to get a product to market very quickly. And I'd seen sampling demonstrated on an instrument called the Fairlight. The Fairlight was one of the very first machines that attempted to do digital synthesis. And most of what it did just wasn't very interesting sonically, but people were excited about this idea of sampling. But the Fairlight cost $35,000, and in thinking about what could our next instrument be, and we needed it in a hurry, I realized that I had a way electronically of being able to compress their design very substantially in terms of the hardware and therefore the cost. And the Emulator 1 was born out of that, which was a sampling instrument. That was the first generation of Emu's sampling instrument. You'll notice that the company name Emu Systems, it's the first three letters of emulator. That's how that name was born. And in those days, some people thought that Emu name came from emulator because they didn't know we'd made analog synths before. So that was the idea. So the Emulator 1 was an interesting instrument, but since nobody ever built a sampler before, we really, in designing that instrument, had nothing to go on. As time went on, we discovered that the sculpting of the sounds was important as sampling the sounds. And so the next generation, the Emulator 2, which is what really caused sampling to take off. And the things we did there were enabling more control over the sound, particularly the looping. When you hold the key down, you want to lengthen a sound, and that's done by repeating portions of it. So the Emulator 2 had a much more sophisticated way to loop that could make sounds much more natural. And then it also had this whole analog synthesizer back end so that you could now filter and envelope that sound as well as playing it back. And that's what moves sampling from just being I press a button and the sound comes out, to I actually can play and sculpt and perform with the musical notes. And my keyboard technique allows me to modify these notes in ways that really, make it into true music.
Yeah, now, did you guys take any of the thought process on how to make that musical from like the Mellotrons, what were used on like the Beatles records, the looping? These folks were looping tape machines pretty much. On each key had a little looping tape machine that would play back a sound. So when we first started with the Emulator 1, we actually occasionally would say this is going to be a digital Mellotron. But once we got there with the E1, like I say, that once you've got an instrument that you can play with and have other musicians play with and give you feedback on, suddenly now you have a whole new palette of what's the next step. And that was the E2. So that was all stuff that was beyond even, the concept of the Mellotron and the tape. And, that, as I say, that's what made it come alive. Yeah. You can, again, I wasn't a keyboard player at the time, but that particular keyboard made me want to be a keyboard player, and I wanted to figure out how. I did end up owning an Emax later on. Mm-hmm. I could afford that.
Yeah.
But the Emulator 2 was just a little bit out of reach. What, they were like 10,000 at the time?
I think they were 8,000 for the
I think if it was blown out with a few other...
Yeah, eventually the end of the Emulator 2 line was the Emulator 2 Plus HD. And the Plus had double the memory of the standard emulator, and then the HD had a hard disk in it as well.
Yeah.
And I think when that was all tricked out, it was above 10.
Yeah. But, I mean, again, compared to 35 or... Synclav, which was in the $250,000 range, that was a reasonable price for a sampler, and that changed the face of music. We wouldn't really have hip hop the way we have it today, for a couple of different reasons. We're talking about the Emulator 2, but you've made and you've been a part of so many iconic, instruments. We could be here for days.
Yeah.
Neither one of us have that kind of time, but maybe we could have a bigger, deeper dive and explore some of that stuff at a later date. But with that said, that was very instrumental. But then when we get to later on with drum machines, you were instrumental in the SB12, 1200s, and the sampling drum machines. Tell us about that and what drove the inspiration for that.
So, improving the Fairlight to be much less expensive and so on with the emulator. After the Emulator 1 came out, I realized that there was a similar technique. Again, I learned the idea when I was at Caltech, something called microprogramming, would enable me to cut the cost of Roger Lynn's Lindrum. Now, as good friends, I actually did the design review for Roger on the LM1 machine. We were buddies, so I in a way we felt bad about cutting the cost, but it was a factor of three. The LM1 was over $3,000, and the Drumulator came out at $995, and we went to Roger and told him we're coming out with it, so it wasn't a surprise to him when we showed up at NAMM with this new machine. So the Drumulator was then followed by the Emulator 2, and that was then followed by what was originally going to be called the Drumulator 2. And in making the design decisions around that, now Roger was at the time designing the Linn 9000.
Yeah.
And so we knew we were competing with him on a more premium level. But neither of us had ears on what the other one was doing. So we chose the 12-bit format because we wanted an upgrade in fidelity from the drumulator, and you couldn't afford to go to full 16 bits back then. Just those converters were just too expensive. Would price it out of the market. And then we put in pitch shifting.
Yeah.
And then the user sampling feature was really the thing that we knew we wanted in there, and that came out as the SP12.
Yeah.
And it was, I guess, a year and a half later that the price on physical disk drives had dropped because of, people were so much getting into personal computers. We could now afford to put a disk drive in it, which now made the user sampling much more convenient because you could save things off onto a disk in a matter of seconds rather than on cassette tape, which is what you had to do with the SP12 to do it. It just was a fortuitous combination of features. The 12-bit isn't perfect fidelity. It's just gritty enough that you can hear this characteristic sound that today is still iconic. Everybody loves that sound.
Everyone still wants an SP12, 1200. Drum emulators are going so expensive on, if you can find them. Yeah, that's crazy. So let's kind of talk less about the tech and let's talk about how it changed the face of music. Both units, the emulator 2, getting any of the other samplers that came out, and then of course the line of drum machines. Did you realize that your technology was going to spawn different genres of music? Because at the time you had rock and roll, you had funk, you had soul, you had country, very basic things. You didn't have EDM, you didn't have spin-offs, a little bit with a Kraftwerk, but that was so, it wasn't mainstream yet. But when you guys created this technology and the kids in New York that were doing hip hop and the guys overseas that were doing the at the time techno or even new wave, that were using the drum machines, what we got before was, you had Phil Collins with "In There Tonight" with the rolling, the little bit more synthetic sound. But you guys brought in this whole. It sounds like a drum. It sounds and feels great. And I was talking with Roger. It makes your booty move.
Yeah.
Did you realize that you were going to change the world that way?
Well, there's a yes answer and there's a no answer, and I want to give them both to you. So. I remember the day, it was in December of 1980 when we first sampled a violin into the Emulator 1. I had gone out to buy lunch for folks just as they were putting in the sample, and I came back and the smiles on Ed Rudnick and Scott Wedge's and Marco Alpert's faces, and our violinist Ken Provost was there too. And they said, "Dave, this is going to change music." And this was before Stevie Wonder saw the E1 at that first NAMM and so on and so forth. But that was the day that we realized that sampling really was going to change music. And so in that sense, we knew what was going on. But how it would change it, particularly with the SP1200. I mean, the SP1200, we were designing as a drum machine, kind of traditional drums. We were still thinking in terms of what we'd done with the drumulator and so on. And then there was fun stuff you could do, taking unusual sounds and using them as percussion and so on, which was kind of an effect. So I remember hearing about this form of music called hip hop, and I'm white bread. I had no clue what that meant. But the guys at Emu came in and said, the drum noise, it's really, the SP12, it's getting really big into hip hop. And me, and particularly my partner, Scott Wedge, okay, what's hip hop? Let's go check out hip hop. And the way Scott described it, somebody made a misstatement in one of the documentaries, and they said that Emu had discontinued temporarily SP1200 because we didn't like hip hop. And I was actually having dinner a couple of months ago with Scott Wedge, and I mentioned that, where did they get that idea? That's so far off. And Scott said, I bet it was me, because we actually had to discontinue the SP1200 for a while because a bunch of the parts suddenly became unavailable.
Oh, yeah.
So we couldn't profitably make the thing. And so we discontinued it, and Scott said, and I had this throwaway line when people would ask me, why did you see production? He said, because we don't like hip hop, because it was so far from the truth. It was a joke. Because anybody who knew Emu knew that we loved all these different musical genres. But Scott said at the same time, he'd gotten, like I had, started listening to hip hop. And both of us, Scott in particular, his description was, at first I was sort of taken back by the coarse language and so on. But then he said, I realized that this was the same kind of expression that the protest music and the folk music in the 60s that we were brought up and loved.
Yeah.
That was what it was about for these black kids in the ghetto. And they were expressing their world and the changes that needed to happen in their language, in their poetry. And Scott said, that was when I got totally behind it. And as president of the company, he basically put his fist down and said, we're going to get back into production with the SP 1200. You've probably seen me in some of my press photos. I have this T-shirt on that says Jurassic Parts, because that was the project. We had to take these parts that were going obsolete and find replacements from them. But that was the SP 12. I'm trying to catch the right word, but basically we brought the SP 1200 back to life. And Scott was driving that because he wanted these hip hop artists to be able to have these instruments again. I said in my talk yesterday that I think that little part that I played in the hip hop movement is like the most thing that I'm most proud of, to be able to, my instruments inspiring musicians. There's nothing that is a greater reward to somebody like who's an instrument designer than to have somebody embrace it and then do something as incredible and I'm
gonna say iconic.
Yeah, iconic as hip hop. I just love that.
It's amazing, man. Well, we don't have a whole lot of time, like you said. I know you're a man on the move here. You've got all kinds of people to see and talk to. Walking with Dave here at Synthplex is like walking with Stevie Wonder. You get stopped every 5 minutes because everyone has something kind or something inspirational that they've been experienced with you. Dave, what do you want the listening audience to leave with about your inspiration and your drive to make just the coolest gear on the planet? What do you want people to know about you?
Well, I think what I'd say, first off is follow your dream, follow your inspiration. Don't let yourself be pigeonholed. Like I said, I grew up as a scientist. Dad was a scientist. I went to Caltech and went into molecular biology. If you live your life in the moment and you're open to that moment, the moment I saw a synthesizer and it was like God taking me by the nose and pointing me in the different direction, saying, "Over here, Dave." Live your life being open to those kinds of experiences. Embrace them, because if you can be lucky enough to have those happen to you and know that they're happening, it's possible that you may have a life as blessed as mine. I mean, I really couldn't be more blessed than to be able to.
Well, you've blessed us, sir. You've blessed us.
Well, that's how the way you're blessed is by blessing others.
Yeah. Well, with that said, folks, blessings to you all that are listening right now. We're at Synthplex 2022. My name is Florentino. I'm here with Dave Rossum. And you guys stay tuned. We've got more podcasts. If you didn't make it here this year, you got to make it next year, because this year is taking it to a whole nother level, especially with guest speakers like Dave. Much love to y'all. We are out of here. Thank you, Dave.
You bet. Thanks a lot.